Good afternoon, everybody. It's very good to be here with my very long-standing, I don't use the word old anymore, long-standing friend, Ernest Moniz. I think we're here to talk about unintended consequences and intended consequences of the energy industry. It's done great things. It's produced light, heat, mobility, freedom for many people, and it's also done some bad things, probably quite unintendedly for most part, to do with the world we live in. So we're going to talk a bit about that. We're going to talk a bit about change and what it takes to change and how long it takes to change and all these things that Ernie knows a lot about.
Is that why you stopped using the word old?
That's right. Well, actually, I was thinking, Ernie, this is about some of these problems are simpler than the problems I have back in the UK called Brexit. So I think let's deal with these. And maybe I could start by asking you the most obvious question is, so what is changing in the energy industry? What's really changing? And how's it going to look in the medium term as well as the long term? What's changing?
Well, first of all, I think I am certainly convinced, and I think most everyone is, that we are changing and will continue to change and evolve towards a low-carbon future. But frankly, despite a number of very clear statements as to exactly what that future will look like, I certainly feel that we have really quite little clue what that future will look like in detail, both because I think the scope and the pace of the low-carbon change will still be subject to many, many forces, among them innovation in technology, actually innovation in business models will be probably very, very important as well. But, I don't think in our conversations we adequately reflect what remain evolving public attitudes, which can be pro or con in terms of the pace, the pace of change. And in terms of going back to the technology question, I think that I will always place my bet on outcomes that stem from innovation as opposed to outcomes that come from various prescriptive approaches, favorite technologies or the like. So I think that's one point. Second point is I think we are seeing in some sectors, most especially the electricity sector, substantial decarbonization in the developed countries. That's very important, and that will continue. But I think with this, we are also seeing the clear signs of the need for very, very different business models and regulatory models. I think, I'll use California as an example, because they are rather out in front, especially in terms of solar deployment, quite significant, probably 15-16% when one includes rooftop solar. And I think what we're seeing are the kinds of distortions in the system. I'm not arguing it's bad. All I'm saying is the system is not prepared for zero marginal cost technologies, especially when they additionally get some subsidies on the capital side.
But let me, if you take 2 points you made and then let me push you on them. So the first is, do you actually think the oil and gas industry has the luxury of time? Because many people, I think, if you go around the world, as you and I do, have almost written it off. They're beginning to say, let's write it off. Is there a substitute for that? And the second point is, and I've been in the renewable energy business for a long time, I would say that the rate of increase in capacity in the renewable energy business remains high, but is far too low, far too small to make a difference to the world at the moment. So how do we reconcile all these things?
Well, I think on the latter point, I agree with you, significant but yet too slow. I do believe that the pace of change, the second derivative will also be positive in terms of the rate of change. Once again, as I said earlier, I don't know if that's going to be high enough to meet the kinds of challenges that are put forward in terms of the science and the likelihood of increasing disruption from global warming and climate change. I note that if one makes the very loose association of 2 degrees centigrade warming and 450 parts per million CO2, that with rational arithmetic, the budget, because CO2 is cumulative in the atmosphere, the budget that is remaining to be exhausted for that 450 is only about 16 years worth at today's rate of emissions globally. So that's 2035 for the energy industry kind of around the corner. And so it's clear that the 2-degree aspiration cannot survive much more inaction, if you wish, in terms of picking up the pace. I do want to emphasize, and I'm going around, and I'll come back to your first question, but that, and it's actually relevant to your first question, is that it's also the case that while there is some significant pace of change in the electricity sector, with solar and wind being, kind of the lead on that, the reality is that accounts for a minority of the emissions. In fact, in the United States as a whole, transportation is now edged ahead of electricity in terms of emissions. In a state like California, it is a significant multiple, like 2.5 times the emissions of electricity. And whether it's transportation, industry, frankly, buildings, and agriculture, we are, I think, nowhere near the rate of progress that we see in electricity, and yet they account for the majority of emissions. So it's also the case that we're going to have to open up the aperture and be very, very aggressive in developing the options for these other sectors. Now, going to oil and gas.
If I can, just it is, to my mind, a very key point that electricity isn't the whole story.
Right.
And some of the policy making has been driven towards making it almost the whole story. But actually, I think globally it is also the minority of emissions.
Absolutely. Transportation is huge, and of course that
industry
immediately takes you to oil.
And
then industry is very, very difficult to decarbonize. There are some electrification pathways, but there's a lot of big challenge for the energy-intensive industries. And of course, industry in particular immediately starts bringing up issues like trade policy and jobs in different countries and the like. So it's also politically very, very difficult. And yet, again, I keep using California as an example. In California, industry is very clearly in second place in terms of emissions beyond electricity. So these are issues that we have to address. And I think here, as you know, and you are as well, very fond of talking about the importance of picking up the pace in terms of technology innovation, and also having that innovation focus, in my view, across the innovation supply chain, if you like, in terms of even federal and government involvement in things like some of the demonstration and deployment activities. That's a longer story we could get back to. But we need, I think, to have a structured approach to the innovation agenda that understands that we have to address various timescales for impact, but all of those today in terms of supplying the groundwork to have major impact. An example there, I think, is, I've already focused on sectors, and you reinforce that with industry and transportation and the like. To be honest, I'm not convinced that we will be able to meet the rather tough targets that have been put out there without going beyond those sectors as well into what I would call large-scale carbon management, direct carbon removal, et cetera. I don't know if we'll ever, today those are daunting costs, but we're also very, very early in any kind of serious attempt I think, to develop those technologies. If we don't, there's some very, very fundamental science involved in much of this. If we don't do that today, we certainly will not have the tools in 20 to 30 years to use them at scale.
So with a finite budget, and if you were instructing the people in this room, where would you say they should focus these the funds
Well,
in trying to solve this problem? Where?
I would note that, let's say, 3x is finite as opposed to infinite. And I do think that, speaking for the United States, I think we do need to increase the level of investment. And of course, back in 2015 at Paris, the Mission Innovation Initiative suggested a number of countries would move towards at least doubling their investments over a 5-year period. I don't see anyone on that pace, although there are some encouraging signs of increase. Now, having said that, I think and again, I'll talk about the American R&D portfolio, especially that supported by the Department of Energy. I think the increase in the budget, let's say a doubling in the budget, is very important because it allows you to plan the portfolio differently. Because let's face it, today, I'll take nuclear energy, and I think looking at advanced nuclear technologies is very, very important in terms
scale,
especially smaller scale, small modular reactors, and now even going to the so-called micro reactors. However, when you look at the needs of a nuclear research program with today's roughly $600 million budget and many, many different directions to support, frankly, there is not the capacity to properly fund the brand new technologies on the way to at least a marketplace test. If you double, it's a whole different world. You can literally plan your portfolio in a different way and accommodate that. So that's an example, I think, that replicates across the board. And in something like carbon direct removal, which can be just air capture, it can be biological sequestration, there are many, many facets to this. The amount of investment in this is very, very tiny, to be honest. It's another area where, again, a major new portfolio would be important.
But the implications of those statements is that, one, it is essential to remove carbon from energy sources, which says that hydrocarbons are going to be used. Otherwise, why would you remove carbon?
No, exactly. No, look, I remain, okay, if you take the carbon removal umbrella, within that I would say is sort of conventional carbon capture and sequestration from power plants, from industrial plants. And I think that's a very, very critical place to go, where once again, I think in the United States and globally, we've been talking about this, we've been doing a few projects over the last 20 years, nowhere near, I believe, the kind of push that is needed for something that could be so central, frankly, to allowing a significant fossil fuel component with all that means in terms of storage, in terms of reliability of a grid, et cetera. Having a fuel gives you a different kind of flexibility than you get from, let's say, large-scale solar or wind deployment. If CCS enables that, great. We just got through saying that industry is a very tough sector to deal with. There are industries with tremendous needs for very high temperature process heat, for example. Maybe carbon capture is a huge part of the answer there. Frankly, if you want to be direct about it, in the electricity sector, we have quite a few options in renewables, in nuclear, et cetera. It may be that the highest use of carbon capture may be in helping solve the industrial challenge when you have concentrated streams of CO2 already there. So I just think we need to open up our thinking and frankly allow the private sector to get the signals it needs to move forward in this way.
And so how do we do that? I think it's true to say, isn't it, that most R&D programs don't work. unless any public funding is matched by at least 3x that from the private sector?
Well, it depends upon the stage and the nature of the project, obviously. There are some very, very fundamental science barriers that generally require federal funding, government funding. But clearly, as one goes on down the chain towards demonstration and development, one certainly needs to have the private funding come in a very, very significant way. But I must say, as secretary, I found, and it was even a little bit surprising, how a degree of participation of the department, even in deployment, was often very, very important to the private sector. There was a certain element of vindication, in a certain sense, in going forward. Sometimes they don't work out, but those are decisions that the private sector then takes. One example where it's fairly obvious, in my view, was what I consider to be the extremely successful loan program, Department of Energy, much attacked because of one foreclosure, forfeiture in the solar realm, but looking at the portfolio as a whole, tremendously supportive, and I think managed in the right way, not trying to, quotes, like dominate a sector, but to get a few projects off the ground and then see if the private sector took it. The well-known best example is utility-scale solar, where there were no projects. DOE loan program got 5 kicked off and then left the field, and there are now 60 or 70 of these projects with private funding. So I think that I know there are some theoretical objections to government involvement at this stage, but in my view, that's fine. Even though I'm a theoretical physicist, technically, we just don't have time, frankly, for a lot of theoretical ruminations. I think we need to be very practical, get down to work, and get the low carbon transition accelerated so that we can stretch out that budget I mentioned earlier well beyond 2035, ideally to the end of the century.
So let me ask you then, there's been a lot of talk, certainly in the United States, about New Deals, Green New Deals. What do you think of those proposals?
Well, look, first of all, I'm going to draw a distinction between a and the Green New Deal. So a Green New Deal, I think, has stimulated a welcome conversation, frankly, in which, and I'm just talking about the climate parts. I mean, I do think there's an issue about the extension of this to many, many other very important areas to be discussed, job issues and healthcare issues and the like. But I think we should really stay focused on what was the original impetus for the Green New Deal discussion, which is the energy climate discussion. Within that, I think what it has added to the discussion about low carbon is a discussion about various kinds of social equity issues. And again, I'm not talking about the healthcare issues, et cetera. Very, very important, obviously, for a separate discussion. But what I'm talking about is, to use a specific example, let's say carbon emissions are priced. How those resources that are collected are then used is an enormous issue for social equity. To be blunt, on one hand, if those funds, which could be considerable, in fact, let's take the George Shultz, Jim Baker, Hank Paulson, so-called conservatives' proposal. They propose a $40+ per ton carbon tax, times 5+ billion tons per year in the United States. You're talking some real money. Maybe a quarter trillion dollars. If that funding, I'll just take two extremes. One is it goes to offset the budget deficit, or at least a quarter of the budget deficit. That would be extremely regressive because the impact in terms of prices, et cetera, would be felt by the poorest in society. I think Mr. Macron learned a little bit about that a few months ago.
Indeed.
On the other hand, if you take the conservatives' proposal to take that funding and just divide it up into equal parts for the population as a dividend, that's actually quite progressive. So, and there are many other ways of approaching this, including not through a tax. All I'm saying is there are enormous political choices to be made as to how a strong climate policy would be implemented in terms of the social equity kinds of issues. So I think a Green New Deal has kind of put that on the table along with the imperative of low carbon. Now comes the Green New Deal. What we've said so far does not define a program. And so now comes the fleshing out of the program. It's going to become real. And here, I think, we've heard many voices all over the map in terms of what would be in a Green New Deal. My pitch is pretty simple. It's time to be pragmatic, to forge, and sometimes there may be frustration that this doesn't seem to be as fast as it should be. But the reality is, if we don't forge political coalitions that can actually move the ball forward, we're not going to get there fast anyway. And I might note that, I used to work for a boss named Barack Obama. And at the very end of his administration, there was a very interesting, and I recommend people to look it up on the internet, a very interesting dialogue on climate change held on the South Lawn of the White House with Leonardo DiCaprio as the moderator, and President Obama, and no one questions his bona fides in terms of addressing climate change. But he said he brought in fracking, he brought in the issue of gasoline prices to some person who has to drive 50 miles each way to work, keep food on the table, et cetera, et cetera. And he made exactly the same point, that until we start recognizing these needs and on fracking, until we start recognizing that it has been responsible for both substantial carbon reductions and substantial economic progress, that we will not get those political coalitions put together. So I think this is what the Green New Deal kind of has brought up, and now it's our job to shape it, and to shape it in a pragmatic fashion.
So I'm going to open it up to the audience in 1 second, but I think in one word, if you were sticking a thermometer into the way you feel about how things are going, in the way in which we're looking at energy and looking at 2 degrees, how do you feel? Optimistic, pessimistic, or not prepared to say?
I obviously not prepared to say would be the best choice. Here.
But that's no good.
But this sounds like Wait, Don't Tell Me, the radio program. Look, I think it's. I don't give up on the 2 degrees at this stage, but I think it is slipping away, and frankly, our current course, you can start counting 3.5 or 4 degrees potentially. I don't think we'll get there because the public will see the impact, what's happening around, and the cost of inaction. But especially because it's cumulative, we are baking in increases beyond what we see today.
So it seems to me very important that whatever we do, we don't set unrealistic expectations, because then they will rebound very badly.
Yes.
On all of us. And I think while there's plenty of change taking place, I mean, a lot of positive signals, new deals, new technology,
right,
new corporate activity, I think, which is good, and a recognition that you can't just carry on. You have to make a change, otherwise you will lose your stakeholders. Mm-hmm. We better make sure we set the right expectations for people as we go forward.
And John, I think that is so important what you just said about losing stakeholders. that I think, completely, patently, obviously impractical solutions don't move us forward any more than those who
They make great
deny the
speeches,
whole thing.
but they don't.
And the reason is, as you say, you lose stakeholders. For example, here's two very, very different groups, both of whom are moving towards the low carbon agenda, in the United States certainly, labor and incumbent energy companies.
Yeah.
Well, if you put forward something that's going to strand huge assets, strand workers, strand communities, they're not going to come along for the ride, and it's going to take longer to get where we need to go.
Good. Thank you. Now, any questions from this extraordinarily distinguished audience that I can see in front of me here? At the back. Over there. That's it. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. I would classify much of what you said as kind of a push, R&D, get the technology ready, get it to market. Can you make some comments on the pull side of things? The role of operating companies in terms of creating demand, local policies, and things like that, and sort of creating demand for innovation, so to speak.
Well, first of all, I think on the pull side, I would actually start with governments because policies have to be put in place as well that provide incentives for the market to work in the right direction. But I want to emphasize that is not only national governments, but of course state governments and states and cities are really moving forward impressively, and much of the incentive I think for going to low carbon has come actually in this country certainly from states and regions. Now I do think another point I would make is that I believe, and frankly I tried without much success when I was secretary, to have a great deal more support for what I would call regional innovation systems. And the reason is that the low carbon solutions in different regions and in different countries will look very, very different. And I think by having a focus on regional systems, you will get a lot of kind of tailored responses I'm not arguing to eliminate, certainly in any sense, a federal portfolio, but I think adding to it these regional innovation efforts will greatly enrich the portfolio focused on areas in which industry, for example, in that particular region can see a most effective response.
And things like low-level pollution have unintended good consequences for carbon management, for example.
Yes.
And that's something that happens all around the world.
Yeah, but also resources are like even renewable resources are quite different in different
Very
places.
different.
Yeah.
Well, the sun has to shine and the wind has to blow.
Yes,
amongst other things.
And in some places the sun shining is a 6-month affair, and in
That's
some
it.
places it's
That's right.
it's
It's
year-round.
So,
Actually, while the mic is getting there, just add one other thing on solar in particular, especially for the mid-latitudes, that I think we often forget that we don't forget that the sun does not shine at night and it shines during the day, but we often forget that the insolation in the summer is significantly higher than in the winter, and so that's a clear example. If solar is going to be a huge part of the system, and I think it will be, it immediately calls for solutions we do not have about seasonal storage.
yeah.
Can you comment on the impact of power to X movements and the circular economy directives of the EU as a way of brownfield improvements on the infrastructure as part of the energy solution?
Well, I think John can answer more of that in terms of the EU, but I think there's much in there to be emulated, I think, and just more broadly, the the infrastructure questions of the transformation in general have not really we've not come to grips with those either. And I think that there's a kind of a systems dynamics problem about, about how we start making enough progress on infrastructure that it is not an impediment to developing various directions. And as an example, in Europe, there is, I think, I sense a much stronger focus for looking at hydrogen as a future than we've seen here. And I think we should be seeing it here, but we're not. It's a classic case of a technology which, if it could succeed, would have many, many sectoral benefits. It's a technology that is today too expensive in terms of electrolysis. But interestingly, I would estimate that today the cost of making hydrogen from water electrolysis, I'm not saying it won't come down with innovation, but today I would argue you can do steam reforming of methane plus CCS at 1/3 the cost. So I emphasize that because this, you see, it's an interesting system issue where we can have various bridges to this future while infrastructure is developing to allow in the future, if there can be great cost reduction on the electrolysis and a supply. Actually, people forget the electrolyzer capital cost is less important than getting enormous amounts of really cheap carbon-free electricity. So these are all big system challenges. I think Europe is actually well ahead of us in that domain.
Over there, Sam, and then this, and then you.
I'd like to pick up on your comment about the regional efforts. As the old saying goes, all roads lead to Rome. We can see around the world, in particular in terms of energy infrastructure, in the context of electricity, you see sort of two visions evolving. One is China's vision. They're going to continue to build more ultra high voltage backbone strong grid. In fact, they just announced some new investment last week. Where you go to countries like India or Africa, microgrid is the way to go. They're just impossible to build maybe that many of high voltage, long distance transmission grid. Whereas I see in this country, in the US, things are a bit unclear. Places like Texas, we can see the crack zone where you connect the wind to the load centers like Houston. But overall, as a country, where do you see the vision of the infrastructure going? Is it going to be more like a centralized backbone, strong grid, or more of a microgrid cluster of load pockets? What's your thought on that?
Yes. Look, if we talk about the United States, first of all, let me reemphasize your first point, that again, different places are going to have very, very different solutions and different needs. And I might add, in a place like Africa, where you mentioned microgrids, another interesting development that we've been looking at is in Africa, you have tremendous amount of resource discovery in natural gas in both East and West Africa. Currently, it's basically all for LNG export. How are we going to turn some of that into economic development within Africa in a sustainable and responsible way? That's one point. Now, going back to your question in the United States, look, we all know that there would be a significant benefit of developing high voltage, let's say electric grid of substantial length to especially move the wind resources, most of all, out of the middle of the country, but also to move good solar resources out of Arizona and the like. The reality is, this is one of those uncertainties I said earlier. There's no doubt it would be a huge boon Whether it can be built is unclear to me.
It's changing the flow. Actually, east, west, north, south are not compatible. Same in Europe.
Yeah, and
The same issue.
and actually many flows, including oil and gas flows in the United States, have changed dramatically. But I'll just as an example, I mean, when I was secretary, we had an issue about using for the first time a 2007 congressional legislated option to, roughly speaking, use eminent domain to get key high voltage transmission built across states. And a particular project came up to move Oklahoma wind into the southeast that was a textbook example of what the Congress intended. Well, there was a state in between. There was therefore litigation. Eventually, the courts ruled in our favor. Didn't matter. The project didn't happen. There was everything logical about that project except local resistance, even given a number of sweeteners in the deal. So that's why I say I would certainly keep pursuing those options when they can go, and there are several that have been built. But it also has led, in my part of the country, in New England, for example, really pushing hard on offshore wind. Offshore wind may still be a little bit expensive today, but you can get the line built. If you build the wind farm, you can get the line built to the load center. So that's why I think it's such a mix of issues of technology and public policy and public acceptance, NIMBY, et cetera.
And I think it's the systems have been built for so long, and there probably is nothing worse than having to retrofit infrastructure. This is if you have none, it's easy. If you have a lot and retrofit, very expensive.
And that's where making incremental steps you can do with existing infrastructure,
Yes.
like hydrogen, you can put 5 or maybe 10%.
And as long as you don't know,
But you can't get the big transition that way.
when you're noticeable, it's impossible to happen.
Yeah.
Sir, there was a question at the back here. And then you.
Yeah.
Who's going to go first? I think
Okay.
on my left, then you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you for joining us today. I had a quick question about what your take is on the future of Yucca Mountain and general nuclear waste management in this country, and what it's going to take for us to look at that as a future energy source in the coming years. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I think the key in terms of the utilities who operate these power plants, I want to emphasize and separate. The key is moving the fuel away from the sites, and then having the federal government take ownership, which is part of the current compact. The ownership is part of the compact. The moving is in principle part of the compact, but is not being exercised. So in my view, I think the 1980s legislation that led to Yucca Mountain was terribly flawed in blocking consolidated storage of fuel for the order of 100 years, and frankly, having it cool off helps as well. And that solves the fundamental problem of the utility operator. It does not provide for the long-term geological storage. But here, Yucca Mountain, I don't know what's going to happen with Yucca Mountain. In the end, this last year, with a Republican-controlled Congress on both sides, the issue of introducing new funding for Yucca Mountain was defeated. I really don't know what's going to happen. But I do want to emphasize Yucca Mountain has significant technical shortcomings. Whether it's enough to say don't do it, That's not for me to decide. But it is not an ideal technical site.
I'm going to cut you off, Ernie, to get another
All
question.
right. I'll just end by saying, but I want to emphasize the real issue is getting what two communities have already said they want to do, receive and consolidate spent fuel before its ultimate disposal in a geological repository.
Quick question?
Yes.
Quick answer.
So this is a good follow-up to that question. As we move forward to increase our portfolio on renewable energy, and as we develop new technologies, do you see any unintended consequences to the environment that we may not be thinking about right now? It looks like wind and solar are going to be in our portfolio mix. Do you see any other unintended potential climate issues or environmental issues with other renewable systems?
With other renewable systems?
Yes. Anything that we develop, is there any other unintended environmental impacts? Not necessarily with CO2, but other environmental impacts with respect to mining or any other potential impacts on the environment that we should be watching out for?
Well, first of all, there's been a long-standing set of issues to be addressed in doing things like large hydro projects. Doesn't change the fact that it is an enormous supply of quotes, carbon-free electricity. On the mining, it is worth people remembering that mining, including mining for renewables, for electric vehicles, batteries, et cetera, I mean, it's not going away. We're going to need enormous quantities of a whole bunch of minerals, and so mining will continue. So look, as it's always the case, the same is true with CO2, with natural gas and fracking. I think you have to look at the overall benefits and then look at how you can minimize the environmental footprints along the entire supply chain. And it's going to be a challenge.
So we've got a minute left. And I'm just going to ask you, but you have to answer this very quickly. I think the first energy secretary I met in the United States was also the Tsar. And I always liked the idea of...
Is that with a T or a C?
With a CZ. I think CZ is, I think, the spelling used by President Nixon. Okay. So if you were Tsar, you really were Tsar, what are the two things you would do to make an optimistic view of the future work here? What would you do?
An optimistic view of the future of work?
No, the future of the climate, the environment, and prosperity. You've got to do the two things together. What would you do? What are the two levers you would pull?
Number one,
30 seconds.
Even though it's an imperfect approach, I would go to a progressive carbon pricing system. I don't think that will get us all the way, but I think it's a huge push. And secondly, I would really get serious about an enormous clean energy infrastructure initiative.
Very good.
Which as an enabler for everything else.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. Ernie, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.